Okay, so let's talk about book three overall. I suppose first thing to say is that we think that the physical UK versions of it, we've brought it out in the US already, um, and we think that the UK versions will be printed and available around about late May, early June, I think. And the digital, I think, Hannah, we were saying that will be available quite a bit sooner. Is that right? Are we thinking sort of
I think around
March-ish?
March, April. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And we did think it was going to be very quick to make a UK edition, but as James and Christine have been going through and making the teachers' notes and looking in a lot of detail, we're thinking, well, maybe we should just tweak the definition of this word or slightly change that note. So we thought we might as well wait for that process to bottom out before we print the UK. So 304 pages. If you use Suburani 1 and 2, then that is the same length as books 1 and 2, really pretty much exactly the same. 8 chapters rather than 16. So each chapter here is about twice the length of a chapter of book 1 and 2. 167 passages and 1,444 lines. So on average, each passage is about 8, 9 lines long. I mean, that's the average. A lot of different authors. You can see they're roughly a balance of verse and prose. A lot of cultural sections, language notes continue. We delve into literary terms. We do a little on hexameter and pentameter. And for each chapter, we pick up on one particular author and have a look at their works. Okay, these are the 8 chapters, and we've chosen them to be topics that we hope the students will be interested in, that we think are relevant to students today. And to, I think, quite a great extent, we view book three as a source book, really, for studying particular themes in the Roman world. So we kick off with love. What sort of 16, 17-year-old isn't interested in love? Uh, Nature is there because we're looking at the environment and how the Romans dealt with their environment and conceptualized the natural environment in the light of global warming and climate change and so on. 35 is really looking at self-perception and perception. How do people view us? How do we view ourselves? Um, 36 is they're picking up on large movements of people that we have around the world today, and we look at the Romans as sort of people who are fleeing war themselves. 37, the theme there is ethics, really, how to live a good life and so on. And that's always pretty juicy for sixth formers, I suppose, to investigate and discuss, isn't it? 38, greed, wealth, brings up a lot of great issues. 39 is looking at living in the city, the practicalities, realities of living in the city, or not. And then chapter 40, looking at how um, how the Romans justified their empire to themselves, to others, and can maybe giving opportunities for us to consider how we justify, UK imperialism, American imperialism, or how we don't know how we're rethinking that, perhaps. But that's why we've chosen those topics. We hope that they're things that the students will be naturally interested in, and there's plenty of good material in the Roman world to discuss that. Um, the authors, the people who come up on the so with the largest numbers of lines, Ovid, Virgil, and Cicero, and that we didn't set out to do that. That's just who we've landed upon when we are looking for content that reflects those and touches on those themes. But you can see the co-stars there are numerous, and if we flick onto the next slide, I hope you can see this. It's going to be very small, I imagine, but I hope it's clear enough for you to see. This is a little grid So for the rows represent each chapter, Amor, Natura, Imago, and so on. Um, and then the columns will show you which authors are appearing in those chapters and how many lines uh, of each author. So if you look at Ovid, for example, Ovid runs through almost all the chapters. Um, and if you look across with 33 at Amor, again, there's a lot of Ovid and Virgil, quite a lot of graffiti there and inscriptions, but Catullus is a big player in that chapter. If you look at on the right-hand side of that grid, total lines per chapter, you'll see that the chapters roughly have around somewhere between 170 and 190 lines there or thereabouts in each chapter. I don't think it's our view or intention that everybody using this book will study every passage in every chapter. You may just want to dip in and out of particular things, or think I really like to look at the topic of ethics or greed or whatever it might be, and you may only use it for that. Um, so feel free to make of it, as you will, really. Um, but just staying with this a little bit, just to show Ovid, 233 lines in total of Ovid, all the way down to just 3 lines of Varro. Um, okay, very briefly to say, for those of you who use Suburani already, the book three with its literature it's not the first time that we work with literature in the course. This is a story on the left from chapter 17, and it's based, in no small part on Catullus 13. So if you look at line 15 of our story, Bene tu cenabis migisco apud me paucis diebus is largely written by Catullus in the first 2 lines of his poem there. And so that's not, it's not chance that these stories as they are. We have tried to sort of drop some of that in along the way to give opportunities, if you want, through book two, to pick up on some original texts. And I think, James, when you were writing this story in chapter 18, you were taking inspiration and some vocabulary and so on from a bit of Pliny the younger, one of the letters. Is that right?
Yes, yes, that's why there are so many fairly weird bits of vocabulary in there because they're Pliny's rather than mine.
Right. So that's chapter 18. And then again in 19, James, you based Cana Ampliati on Cana, or part of Cana Trimalchionis. And I think when Lila was writing this story in chapter 30, she was channeling some Virgil. And this one that I did in chapter 32, actually, I didn't do much of. As you can see, most of that is in green, was mainly written by Suetonius. So all the way through book two, we're trying to move the students over to sort of a greater comfort looking at original Latin. Um, and then this is where book three starts. So I thought it'd be useful just to have a look at some spreads of the book so you can see physically what it's like. Perhaps no surprise, and we're starting with love. We're starting with a few very short, pretty accessible epigrams. So that's how we go in. Um, Obviously, quite meaty, quite fun, quite, in some senses, quite emotional. That first one, a lot can be done with it. So that's how we start. Very short there, 2 liners. The idea is that they should be able to be studied and considered. Probably all three of those in a single lesson. At least I guess that's what I would do. Um, Here, just to show as we go through chapter 33, the passages get a little longer. So we're heading more towards like K there. That's roughly sort of 8, 9 lines, isn't it? Just to quickly look at J at the top right there, nothing can last. It's very unusual for us to have passages entirely in English, but we've done that there just at the start to just try to get some extra text in, extra ideas in. And we're looking here, as you can see, at graffiti with an idea of just helping the students to sort of consider where have some of these texts come from, and One of the topics we look at is textual transmission there in 33. And also just to very briefly to say, although we have lots of little passages, in most of the chapters, there's also a longer narrative. So here in 33, for example, we've got Virgil 4, and this runs in total to just under 40 lines. Okay, so there'll be quite a lot of short passages by individual authors, and then most chapters, as I say, have a longer narrative there. Um, very briefly to touch on integrating the language, we'll look at sort of language notes in a moment. But just to say that we've done our best to integrate language topics with the text that we're studying. Obviously, in books 1 and 2, we wrote the stories to reflect plenty of examples of the new linguistic feature, and clearly we can't do that here. And we haven't really tried to choose passages because of their linguistic content, if you like, their grammar. We've tried to choose the passages pretty much entirely based on their, what they're saying about the particular theme. But if you look here, Catullus 5, Vivamus mea lesbia aqua amamus, and then in line 3 we've got Aestimamus, and in 11 what we've got Sciamus. So it's a good opportunity here to get into the present subjunctive. So that's what we're doing. You'll notice down in line 12 we've got a posset. And as we go over the page here in E, in the final line, we've got a sit. So that brings us into present subjunctive of irregular verbs. But if you look at what we're doing there, in paragraph 2, okay, well, we've got examples of, sim and possim in those texts that we've just seen. But in paragraph 3, we haven't got examples of wellim, nollim, molim, and so on. We just can't do that. And we thought to separate it out, separate that content out from the content in paragraph 2 would be feel a little bit artificial. So there will be less, I suppose, proximal contextual examples or fewer examples of the new linguistic feature in the text that the students are reading at that point. Just briefly to show then, this is from the following chapter, that this is how things settle down once we're out of 33 and into the sort of the standard chapters that from there on, we've got there a passage in B of 7-8 lines long. You'll see the sort of length of notes that are there. There's glossing of the vocab on the right hand side. We gloss vocabulary where it is either an entirely new word in the course, that word that hasn't been used before, or where it's being used with a new meaning. And you'll notice we've got a few questions under that passage and under those notes. And on the right hand side, we're picking up on the cultural aspects of that. Okay, we also have notes, as well as notes on language, we have notes on literary style. And at the back of the book, you'll find definitions and some examples of literary terminology. Okay, very quickly on the language. This is what we've covered in book 1 of the course. So blue content is nouns, green content is verbs, purple is adjectives and so on, and orange is syntax, really. So book 1 mainly sort of nouny on the whole, with a bit of everything else scattered around. Book 2 becomes quite verby, and we do the passive, and then in chapter 23 we get into the imperfect and pluperfect subjunctives and uses thereof for GCSE. Let's look then at the language topic for topics we've chosen for book 3. First thing to say, these chapters are twice as long as the book 1 and 2 chapters, so they're running to about 30 pages. So we typically have 4 language notes rather than 2 or 3 that you may be used to in books 1 and 2. Chapters 33 and 34. Well, 33, we're doing the present subjunctive, as we've just seen, irregulars and passives, and a little bit on alternate verb forms. 34, we're doing the perfect subjunctive. So by the end of 34, the students have done, all of the forms of the subjunctive. And then we start getting into, for the rest of 34 and 35, uses of the subjunctive. That relative clauses characteristic, I think that's still using the sort of US terminology. I think in the UK, we'd probably call that a generic subjunctive, I think, wouldn't we? Chapter 35, carrying on with uses of the subjunctive. 36, gerunds, gerundives, uses thereof. 37, conditional sentences and bringing the future perfect. 38, well, now we're really starting to sort of scrape the bowel of bits of grammar that we might want to put in, but supine, semi-deponents, deliberatives, Greek nouns, and then you can see where we're getting onto in 39 and 40, quominus in 39 and queen in 40, and oratio oblique and so on. So that hopefully gives you a sense of the fact that book three, across its sort of 300 odd pages, will cover a lot of the language topics that you might want for A level. And then at the back of the book, examples of particular uses of the cases that are usually touched on in the student notes alongside the passages as we go. So plenty of uses of the ablative. As in books 1 and 2, 20 words chosen for learning in each chapter. All of these words, now that we're sort of gone beyond the GCSE vocabulary by this point, which is covered in books 1 and 2, here these are all high frequency Latin words. So they're words that are in the top 1000 Dickinson frequency list. And they will only be in those lists if they've appeared 3 times or more in the course. And obviously dictionary at the end, which as with dictionaries for books 1 and 2, makes reference to where that particular word has been set as a learning word in the learning lists. Finally, I think on this to say that, and we'll look at the digital later, but for every passage, if you don't want the students, having the digital where they can click on the words, for every passage, we've created full vocabulary lists, full word lists, like little mini dictionaries for each individual passage. So this is looking at an example from chapter 34 for the first passage there, passage A, which is broken into different sections. And you can see there that the numbers on the right-hand side are again the chapter in which that particular word was set as a learning word. And I think it should give the students some confidence that quite a lot of the words in these passages either they have already learned or they're going to be set as particular learning words during the course of book 3. So that's quite reassuring, I think, that if they are learning their vocab as they should have a good way into these texts. Okay, Hannah, let me hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Will. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the civilization and the cultural content of book 3. So in many ways, it's similar to the approaches of books 1 and 2. So right from the start in book 1, we get students looking at ancient sources, so both written sources and material evidence. So these pages are from chapters 3 and 4, and the students are interrogating the sources to make some conclusions about the ancient world. We also incorporated STEAM or STEM topics. So the next page, yeah, in the chapters from early on. Sometimes it gets quite technical. And then on the next page, even early in book 1, we tackle some quite difficult topics. So here, as early as chapter 6, we're looking at the life of a slave. And in chapter 8, we look at the different reactions of British leaders in resist or accept. So reacting to the arrival of the Romans. And the profiles we've chosen there were chosen to represent the different responses to the Roman conquest. And so the exercises to encourage students to see both sides, so reasons for and against cooperating with the Romans. So with these more complex topics, we often offer a variety of sources so that we don't oversimplify these topics, and also to encourage students to form their own conclusions and think about the content of the source, but also its limitations and any possible bias. So later in book 2, we have also included some very diverse topics to give a sense of the breadth of the Roman Empire, and some just more particular and peculiar details of daily life. So if we carry on to book 3, we are continuing to integrate the teaching of Latin texts and cultural sections. We investigate material and textual sources jointly, introduce a range of ancient authors in the civilization pages, and obviously within the literature as well, particularly in book 3. To interrogate images, focus on a diverse range of topics, connect learning about the Roman world to students' own experiences and our contemporary society, and to allow students to form their own opinions. So this is the title page of chapter 34. So this is the second chapter in book 3. As Will said earlier, the book is arranged thematically, and this chapter is about Natura. So we have the lovely wall painting of the goddess Flora, but if we look at the question at the bottom of the page, we can get a sense of what is covered in this chapter. So I've just got it bigger on the next slide. So each chapter starts with some guiding questions. So here we've got, what does it mean for humans to live in harmony with nature? And how can we understand and accept the unseen natural forces that control the world we live in? So questions like this at the start of the chapter open up some ideas about what's going to be included in the topic. So you could start the chapter with a short discussion here about humans living in harmony with nature, natural forces in our world, what that means to us. So students could start to answer this based on their own contemporary experience, but they could also think about Roman reactions based on what they've read and then what they know so far. If we look on the grid here, you can see that within each chapter, it's divided into subsections, which usually have a few different Latin passages in, and often, but not always, a cultural section. And then on the page, either with the Latin passages or the cultural content, we've got more questions about this subtopic as a whole. So you're investigating the topic, looking at both the literature and the culture. So James is going to talk a little bit more about how the literature and the culture are integrated in the book in just a minute, but we can see here how the cultural content is just interspersed with the Latin passages forming these subtopics. And we've got these initial guiding questions at the end of the chapter as well, just at the bottom of this page, just as a reminder that at any point you could come back to these and have a discussion about the contents of the chapter, what you've learned, and if your thoughts have changed at all after reading the contents. So I've just got a few examples from chapter 34 on the civilization. So this subtopic is called Exploiting the Earth, and it's just this spread. It's all contained here. So it's the Pliny passage and the English text. So here Pliny is talking about mining and various different metals and gemstones that are dug out of the ground. And he's actually quite critical of desire for luxury and its demand on nature. And then the facing page expands into just different ways that the Romans exploited nature. So cutting down forests, pollution, so industrial pollution from mining particularly, and then consumption and dumping of amphorae at Monte Stachio. So many of the topics we've chosen, as Will said, we chose these topics for book 3, hopefully because students will find them engaging, particularly because they're topics which we still discuss and care about today. So here's an example of, recycling and pollution. And so the students can answer the questions on this spread using information from Pliny's source and the English text on this page, and also their own knowledge as well. So the next section, which comes directly after Exploiting the Earth, looks at cultivating the earth. So in some ways, a similar idea, and building on that initial guiding questions about what it means for humans to live in harmony with nature. So this section starts with the passage from Lucretius about people who first learned to cultivate land and how this changed the landscape. And then we have a few extracts from Cicero on mankind's use of nature. Then on the next page, after the Cicero, we have the facing page, feeding the people. So this expands on this topic and goes into a much more detailed description about the grain supply, which is super important for keeping Rome going. So this culture section from book 3, we've continued to include lots of Latin sources. either in translation or with a translation. So here we've got an extract from Augustus's Res Gestae. And this is something that we've tried to do throughout the whole of book 3. So even though the chapters are arranged thematically, there's lots of concepts and ideas that come up again and again, so students can draw connections and become a bit more familiar. So on this page, the idea of imperial propaganda and the Res Gestae, and also you can see latifundia. They come up throughout the whole book, almost every chapter, I think. So they're both themes that, come up again and again. So the 8 chapters aren't completely distinct. So there's definitely themes that weave in and out, which hopefully will build a kind of more holistic understanding of the ancient world for the students. The next spread, we move on to endangering the wild. So we've got examples from Cicero and Martial about Romans capturing wild animals to be displayed or hunted in games. And then on the facing page, we expand on to looking at the scale of this practice of importing wild animals, and also at the overuse of silphium, which was a plant a bit like fennel. And so again, the Civ page includes various sources, either in translation or with a translation. And if we look at the first question on this page, sorry, it's very tiny, but I'll read it out. It says, evaluate the reliability of the sources on this page in determining the extent to which Romans had an impact on the natural world. So as in books 1 and 2, in the Civ sections, we're asking students to interrogate the ancient sources and think about their reliability and any possible bias. And I think that students are really being asked to think about how to approach the sources and what we can learn from them. And that's what students are also doing when they're looking at these passages of literature in any Latin text, really. So that's what we think is one of the main reasons to read Latin literature, so to find out more about the ancient world. So it's just building these skills with the culture as well, about interrogating those sources to find out more. Just very quickly, this spread on natural disasters, it's got the account of Tacitus about the earthquake of AD 17. I'm just showing this here really just to show that just like in books 1 and 2, we use maps when useful, particularly important as we have tried to include passages that really go over a wide range of locations within and a few outside of the empire as well. And like in books 1 and 2, we do also have a map of the empire at the start of the book. And since the content of the book covers not only a wide range of locations, but also a wide time frame, we've got the empire here at its largest extent in AD 117, but we've also included some notes to explain some important changes at various points in time. So now coming back to chapter 34, and each chapter, as Will said, we've got this biography of a Roman author, and well, actually in this chapter we have 2. We've got Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger. So there's usually a short fact file on the left, and then some information about the author's life and context that they were writing. So again, this is to give students a bit more important background information about some of the authors who appear a few times within the textbook. But we do still also have an overview at the back of the book on all the authors included in the textbook. So just on the next slide, you can see, so that's all the authors, just a very short biography. But we chose these next 8 authors to go into a bit more depth. And as Will showed, these are the authors who come up again and again. And probably if your students are going to continue studying classics or Latin, they are probably going to spend more time with all of these authors. So we go back again to chapter 34, just at the end. So we've got that longer narrative. And in this chapter, we've got Daedalus and Icarus. And we've got 4 extracts. And then on the next facing page, we have Bruegel's painting, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus, along with a poem by William Carlos Williams, which responds to the Bruegel painting. And throughout the book, there are various pieces of modern art or more modern art and literature for students to look at alongside the Roman texts, so they can start thinking about reception and just drawing connections across time. So in book 3, we're building on what we learned in books 1 and 2 and those approaches, and also expanding cultural teaching to introduce students to a wider range of time periods and locations, to include more evidence in Latin in the cultural sections, to focus on more complex social historic questions and multifaceted issues, to focus on reception and comparison with sources from different time periods and cultures, to introduce students to the lives and works of a selection of Roman authors, to expand students' ability to assess the bias and limitations of sources, to engage with large investigation evaluation questions that encourage synthesis of the primary sources and cultural sections, and to draw conclusions between the 8 themes to build a deep understanding of key issues. And I don't want to take up too much more time before passing over to James, but just to give a few ideas of some of the various topics that are covered, I'm just going to whiz through a few examples. So some pages like this one on Triumph are quite straightforward, whereas some are a bit more conceptual on Pudicitia. And pages like this, I think, are particularly important. Oh, sorry, just Pudicitia. Just for defining some of those concepts and some of those words that come up again. So here we've got ideas like virtus, which comes up through lots of chapters as an idea which students really have to grapple with and kind of understand before they can understand the text, really. We also have a couple of examples of these larger social and economic topics. So we've got urbanization and consequences of expansion. And just in the centre there, you can see the latifundio again, which comes up all over the place. And then this chart on the right, this is from chapter 40. So this is the last chapter of the book. And this really draws together content from all 8 chapters and getting students to think about what they've learnt if they have studied all 8 chapters. Otherwise, lots of interesting new ideas. And then we've got some examples of connecting topics to these more modern sources. So we've got first on the left, Pushkin's response to Ovid's poetry from Pontus, along with a Delacroix painting. In the centre, we've got a painting by Max Ernst, which was displayed in an exhibition about artists in exile. So again, that's looking at art in relation to Ovid's exile. And then later in chapter 38, we're looking at a page on looting and war. So that's a topic which is just very relevant today. We also have a few examples of STEM or STEAM topics, including concrete, which is my personal favourite. And then finally, I've got just a few pages of just to show how we do sprinkle a few interesting and unusual topics within the book. So we've got mirrors and pearls. And now I'll just pass over to James, who's going to look at one section of the book in a bit more detail.
Thank you. Yes, I realise probably I should have called this a close look at another section of book 3 because you've just seen chapter 34 in an awful lot of detail. But I'm going to spend just a few minutes looking at the opening pages of chapter 35, which is the Imago chapter. So on the next slide, we'll see the title page. And I think the image straight away alongside the word Imago perhaps gives the idea that this is going to be a little bit about preparing yourself so that the image of yourself that you want others to see, and of course the question at the bottom of the page helps to guide that, saying how important is reputation both during our lifetime and after? In what ways can we present a particular image of ourselves to others? And particularly the expression "and after" is actually what's going to become more apparent in some of this earlier section of chapter 35 that we're going to take a look at. And sure enough, once we turn the page and get into the first double page spread, the image, I suppose, instantly draws the eye, the street of tombs in Pompeii. Actually, the first text is not overtly about tombs. It's Horace discussing how his poetry might be an everlasting memorial. But we get straight into this idea, the section is called An Everlasting Monument, that actually in some cases it's not about just presenting an image of yourself during your life, it's trying to create an image of yourself that will last after your life is over. And so just to sort of dive in and see some of the features that we've already heard bits about, but just to focus in on them. With passage A, I mean, we can see straight away that the passage has a reference letter, but also it has both a title and an introduction, which hopefully help to prepare students for what they're about to read. As they do start to read it, they get the 2 sources of help on the page itself: the vocabulary glosses to the right of the passage itself, and then the set of notes underneath. I mean, just to say a little bit about these, I mean, I think the point of the words to the right of the passage is very much where this is a sort of straightforward gloss that you can take the meaning as it appears in that gloss and read it in. As I think Will said earlier, these are words that are either new or are being used in a very new way with a different meaning. But you'll also see, if you look at the note, the very first note, actually there's another word that's translated for you straight away as well. So in some cases, the notes also provide a bit of help in terms of actually what individual words or groups of words mean. And that might be where a particular sort of contextual translation is needed, or the translation might need a little bit more explanation than is possible just in the gloss box itself. But actually, that does mean that across, what is a 16-line poem from Horace, actually quite a lot of the words are either presented on the page in the gloss box, or they're translated or given guidance for in the notes underneath. The notes also help in some cases with the language, with the grammar of what's going on, to help students as they read them. You can see, well, possibly you can see, I know it's a little bit small on the screen, but the note on line 4, possit, subjunctive in a relative clause of characteristic, as Will said earlier, that's what we might otherwise call I think a generic subjunctive. So it's just sort of making sure that that's something that you might have seen earlier in the book, but just to remind you, this is the precise way that it's working here. Sometimes there's a little bit of what we might say is sort of advice given. The note you might be able to see on line 10, where it says "Dicarte deduxisse," we say take those together. So the notes, as well as sort of pointing you in the direction of the language, do sort of help put the words together. And sometimes there might be some comments about style as well. I can see the word metonymy in brackets in the note on line 7. That will be a word that's appeared before. The first time words appear, they tend to get a little bit more of a definition than that, as we'll see a bit later on. Something that I should also point out, that you can see if you look right down in the notes to the penultimate one, that is on lines 14 to 15, starting "Sume superbiam quaesitam meritis." Sometimes we give a literal translation in brackets so that it really helps you to see how the English words might relate to the Latin words. But then where we feel a less literal translation to help really understand the meaning is necessary, we put the two side by side. It's worth saying, and I think Will's going to talk about this when talking about the digital materials, that these are not, in fact, the only notes that are available, at least to you as teachers, because there are available online teaching notes for every passage. Those include a translation of the text, but also various other bits of information. You'll get but potentially a more precise textual reference. I mean, not for this passage, because I mean this is Horace Odes 330, but I mean sometimes it tells you absolutely which precise lines we've used. It tells you what form the text takes. I mean, this one is obviously a verse text, but it clarifies whether it's verse or prose, which isn't always clear, perhaps, with some of the inscriptions at first glance. And if it's verse, it tells you what meter it is. But the teaching notes also give you some further language comments. We try to make sure that we're referring to other relevant sections in Suburani books 1, 2, and 3, and also sometimes for the students in the textbook, we present Latin as if it's absolutely straightforward, and this is definitely what this sentence means. In the teaching notes, we're possibly slightly more honest and say, well, there are lines of Latin where it could be interpreted like this, it could be interpreted like that, and so it gives you as teachers the chance to discuss that with the students if you want to, but it doesn't absolutely overload the students by putting it in the textbook, of saying, yeah, you never know with Latin, it could be one of lots of different interpretations. We thought it was better to keep that in the teaching notes. Anyway, much the same could be said about passage B, but I suppose the fact that it's flagged up as epitaph of Claudia, I mean, here we start to get into a section that is very much thinking about how Romans wanted to present themselves after their death. Interestingly, the introduction makes the point that this particular text comes from about 150 BC, and that's one of the exciting things. I think about the collection of texts in Book 3, that some of them are earlier and some of them are later than the Latin that students might be familiar with. This one being earlier means that there are some fairly unusual word forms, and so slightly rarely in the book, underneath this passage, there is a sort of conversion grid where we show how the words in the text might convert to regularized Latin forms. Something that's nice about this passage is that students might actually remember encountering it before in English in chapter 16. And that's one of the things, again, that I think is really nice, that in Book 3, perhaps you get to see the Latin version or the Latin origin of particular texts and ideas that you've seen earlier in the course. Underneath the two sets of notes for this, we get some questions. These relate one to passage A, in fact, and one to passage B. And then also that lovely contextual image, which helps to sort of link things together. I mean, we haven't yet got, as we will do on the next double page spread, to a cultural section in text, but we have already here got this image, which helps to make the point, as it says at the end of the caption, funerary inscriptions sometimes directly address those who passed by, exactly as text B does, starting with hospes. Anyway, if we do turn over to get the next double page spread, we see some very famous tombs in the form of the pyramids, and again we now get a different type of text. We've got a graffito. This is a slightly unusual graffito in that it doesn't actually exist anymore, because the stone on which it was written has presumably been carted off and reused somewhere in Cairo, but we know about it because it was written down in the past. And so, already within the first three texts of this chapter, we've had a Horace poem, an established bit of literature, then an inscription, and now a graffito. So it's really nice to get that range in. Again, we've got questions on this particular text, but just to, I suppose, look ahead slightly, the first three lines of this poem, which is actually still written in verse, are, if I can just get Will to jump ahead, and then we'll come back to this. On the next page, we've got one of the sections of the book which focuses on the meter of Latin poetry, and those three lines from the graffito, the first three lines, are the example lines that appear in paragraph 1 and then again in paragraph 3. So again, much as Will was saying that the language points tend to emerge from the text that we've got, so we try to take the metrical examples as well. Just to go back, sorry, Will, to the previous bit here, we do have the memorialising after death cultural section. Some of this we can see in the second line, it talks about setting up monuments. The second chunk is all about funerary monuments, saying that many of them were inscribed. But then towards the end of that paragraph, we have the comments that some Romans did, however, plan and commission their own funeral monuments in advance of their death, wanting to choose exactly how they would be remembered. And that very much looks ahead to a text that comes a little bit later in the chapter, we'll see in a minute, an extract from Petronius's dinner party of Trimalchio. So I think that shows that although this text comes at this point in the chapter, it's already drawing in lots of ideas that have emerged from the text that we've read so far, but it also helps to prepare students for what they're going to read a bit later on. So to go back to the next spread, you can see down at underneath the meter section, there's another really tiny text, an inscription. Something that's perhaps worth flagging up here is the note on lines 2 to 3. You might think it's a bit strange that it says literally "will have done," "will have disrespected." Why don't we call that the future perfect? Well, because in fact the future perfect isn't encountered until chapter 37, and so we try to explain things not by just giving them a label until the point in the book where we've actually sort of discussed that label, and it's in any case it's probably more useful here just to know how to translate it. So that's what we've done. then you can see on page 71 starts this long section. I mean, in chapter 35, this is the longest text, divided into parts 1 and part 2, which we'll see in a moment. A good chunk of Petronius to read. For all of these texts, as I've been saying, there are the set of teaching notes available online. Other sorts of things that you might find in the teaching notes are bibliographic references, either to actual books or to websites and online resources. Sometimes we include alternative readings. I mean, we, and I don't really include myself in this, but others in the team have had to make decisions about what Latin actually gets printed in this book in terms of individual words where there's scholarly dispute about them. And so sometimes we include in the teaching notes versions that we haven't chosen, but just so that, again, if you want to discuss that side of things with your students, you could. Sometimes we also include things where, you know, if you really want to know what type of subjunctive it is, we'll talk about it there, because it's not necessarily helpful when a student's reading it, but someone might just ask, you know, oh, sir or miss, what is that type of subjunctive? What's it doing? And we can give it a label. But also, we just try to make sure that you know, you've hopefully got at your fingertips with those teaching notes things that you might need to know when teaching this, or things that you might want to be aware of. A good example, though, from page 71, the notes that are actually on the page of something that's worth just drawing out, is we can see the note on line 9 where it says erit mihi curai. I will take care, literally, it will be a concern to me. If we jump to the next double page spread, we will see that actually the first language note in this chapter is precisely about the use of what's here called the double dative. We might also call it the predicative dative. And so, again, you can see in paragraph 1 that precise phrase that's taken from the Petronius that the students have read by this point is the jumping off point for the language note. So hopefully students are able to deal with it thanks to the notes on page 71, but then you can discuss it in the language note context a bit later on. Something on the notes on the other page, just on part 2 of the passage, you can see towards the end of the notes the word asyndeton in blue and bold letters. That's because that's a new stylistic feature, a new literary term that's being introduced. But again, lots of the other notes are the same sorts of things, discussing the language, discussing advice, helping students translate. So hopefully, having a look at these few pages has given you a bit more of a flavour of how hopefully the different sections are working together. Because I chose the first few pages of a chapter, one thing that it doesn't show you is that at the end of each chapter you get a sort of language practice set of exercises as well. So they aren't there, but you know, you can imagine what sort of things they look like without needing to see them. Anyway, I'll hand back to Will, who's going to pick up, I think, on digital things.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. Let me just come out of that in that case, and pop over to the website. Is that coming up on the screen, the website there? Okay. So just to explain then, what we've been looking at on the whole there are shots taken from the North American edition, and we're going through and tidying that up for the UK. So some terminology may change between the two editions as well. Let's think then at the digital. If you use Suburani now, you'll be used to this screen. You land here when you log in. Well, I'm just going to click this book 1 bar, that folds it up. And what we're looking at here is the North American site. So North American teachers are already getting this experience, if you like, and this is what will come to the UK in a couple of months. When you log in, you won't have to do anything. The book 3 bar will appear there. Just click on it, it will open up. So you will get, and you may decide, well, then I don't need to buy the book and I'm going to save a lot of money. And that's completely, that is completely fine if that's the way you want to go. You know, this is a non-profit sort of activity, the whole thing. So absolutely feel free to only use the digital if you want to. Click that bar, you'll see exactly as you've got for the other chapters in 1 and 2, exactly the same thing. So let's click, for example, chapter 34, Natura. We're going to open that up. That's going to be exactly the same as you're used to. If I click here on open the active book, what you will notice is because there are so many passages, this is quite a long list of elements there. But we thought that was probably the better way of doing it rather than sort of concatenating them all into much bigger topics, because this does make it much easier to find the particular thing you want. I'm just going to point out at this point, these squares here, because I'm not sure that everybody realizes this. If I just click on those overlapping squares here for A1, it's going to open up. But the other thing that it does is it copies the address of that particular part of the active book to the clipboard. So if I open another tab and paste that in, you'll see that that takes us directly to that particular point. The rest of it is all there, but it's a shortcut to that particular point. The reason I'm drawing attention to it is that if you're going to use the book 3 with your students digitally, you might find that's very helpful for making sure they read the particular passage that you want them to, if you send that to the students. Okay, so here's the active book. There's not a vast amount to say about it, really, because it's just like the active book that you're used to from books 1 and 2. You're getting everything that you'd expect. That's in the textbook there. Where there's meter sections, they're going to be there. James mentioned language practice exercises, so we can see this is the language practice page for chapter 34. I'll just sorry to zoom. I know it's not pleasant when you're looking at a presentation and the screen zooming, but let's come back to this one. The same sort of thing as you might be used to from books 1 and 2, where you can click on the words and you'll get the vocabulary and the contextualized parsing. And obviously you can turn that off, so you just get the vocabulary. And for those of you who don't know the course, teachers have the ability behind the scenes to log in and turn this support on and off for the students. So if you're worried about the students having too much lexical support there, you can turn it on and off for a class, at the drop of a hat. Probably the other thing to say is that little plus sign, will make this very big for whole class presentation. And Hannah, you're working on bringing audio along for this, so that'll be a work in progress. That's going to take a bit of time for everybody, the various people who help us out with the audio to sort of record, and then Hannah to process it all, but that will come along. So those are the active books themselves. If we go back to the page, obviously we'll be working on web links and some activities and so on. Again, that's going to be a work in progress. The vocab trainer now does go up to chapter 40. If I click on that, you can see there we've got all the chapters in place now. But I really want to look at the resources that we're putting in place here. So again, if we just choose passage B, James was telling us about the teacher's notes. So here's an example. They're not all finished yet. I think we're part way through. Well, James and Christine have written most of them. I'm slow getting them online. They're up for about halfway through chapter 37. I suspect by the end of February, they'll all be in place. So as James was saying, you get some more information about the passage in terms of where it's come from. A translation there, let me zoom in a little bit. Christine's developing those translations, and the aim is to sort of, walk the balance between it being literal enough to help us understand it if we're struggling ourselves with exactly how is this Latin working, and fluent and fluid enough to present the sense of actually what it's saying. So a translation of each passage, and then James, as you were saying, here we've got teacher level notes on the passages. So they're relatively short documents because they're only working on 7, 8, 9 lines, but we've organized them by individual passage. As I said earlier, there's also a full vocabulary list for each passage. So can just make it that little quicker, can't it, for students reading a passage? They're not having to look through a huge dictionary. They're not using the digital. And then something that won't be so familiar to us in the UK are tiered readings. I think I'll just choose possibly a different example. Let's go to Spring of Bandusia so that we can look at a verse passage. Tiered readings are essentially easier versions of the text. So these are things that our colleagues Lee, Grace, and William are putting together. They're used more in North America than they are in the UK, but I think you might find them helpful. Let's perhaps start from the other end. So I'm going to scroll to the end. So there we have the original text of Fons Banduziae. And you can see that the third tier has got to the point where it's got stanzas, but it is, if you sort of look at the details of the language and some of the vocabulary and some of the grammar, it will be a little easier than the original. And then if we scroll back again, tier 2, well, here we've got a version of it which is prose rather than verse. And again, the language, the vocabulary will be, another step more accessible. And then tier 1 is going to be the very easiest version. So, you can use these as you will. Some teachers will study through all 3 tiers before then looking at the original. So you might end up reading the passage 3 or 4 times. And it does give students, a good way in. You might say, actually, I'm just going to look at this first tier, going to give me a lot of the vocabulary, it's going to give me a lot of the structures, it's going to give me and the students a good sense of what this poem is about. And then you could go straight to the original, and the students will have that much more familiarity with, as I say, vocabulary, some structures, and overall intent. Or you might jump in at 2 and then go straight to original. Use them as you will. If you use the third book, I would just say try them out. Try different ways of using them. See what happens. See what you find works. What doesn't work so well. There's not going to be any real harm done, is there? Just sort of experimenting with them a little bit. And I think probably that's everything there is to say on the digital. The teacher resources for the community are going to be very hollow at the moment because it's early days and there isn't going to be a lot of material there. So we will try to do our best to produce more digital resources and so on to support. Okay, I think that's probably enough of us talking for the time being. Do you have any questions? Are there any comments? Anything we want to say? Simon, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you for that. Hopefully you can hear me. Just looks absolutely fantastic book, and can't wait to start using it. Do you imagine that it could be used as an A-level textbook just to follow on from the book 2?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to be honest. I mean, I haven't taught A level for quite some time, so it's difficult to know. I would have thought so. What I used to do, and you guys might take different approaches, but I used to, at least in the lower 6, start with a range of different texts and just get the students, the kids, into reading a little bit more and pick up some of the grammar. And I certainly feel that that one could do that with this. Sarah, I know you have used bits of it, sort of trial bits and pieces, haven't you, with even your year 11s before they do the original texts for GCSE even, is that right? Or
Yeah, I did a little bit of the Catullus. And yeah, so you can, because I just had the the text from you. So I'll use it a bit because with Welsh Board this year, we are doing that Catullus and the 2 short poems and so on. So yeah, I mean, you just obviously haven't done the grammar with them because they don't need the present subjunctives. But I mean, I have I have called, they're bright kids. I can tell them that's a present subjunctive, etc. They don't need to know for GCSE, but yeah, I have used it a bit. And I mean, I can
Yeah.
imagine. I mean, the thing with, I mean, again, like you, I haven't taught A-level for a while, and I think the pressure with A-levels always is the set texts that you never know when exactly to start with them. But I think as an anthology and as a bridge of the grammar, that would be a fantastic book to use.
Thanks, sir. I think if I were, dropping in to teach A level now, I'd obviously you want to look at the structure of when you need to teach your literature and so on. But there's going to be gaps of time around the place. And I think I would like to dip in and out of this, maybe to take a particular chapter or a particular theme, look at that, and then maybe go into one of the set texts for one, then maybe think, oh gosh, Cicero's been banging on a little bit. Let's read, a little bit of something else for just an individual lesson or a week or whatever it might be. So yeah, I would do that. I mean, I'm a little cautious thinking, okay, I mean, I remember when I did some A-level cover a few years ago for Verity. Is it Owen? Is it Michael Owen? Someone Owen? I mean, I used a book that Verity was using, which was very clearly very targeted for A-level, and this isn't that. So I would, I would just caution a little bit. But I definitely can see a place for it. I'll be completely honest, we designed it for the US market primarily because it's doing a particular job there. But we thought we might as well make it available in the UK because it's not a lot of additional work for us. I mean, it will be, if you're using the digital, there will be no extra cost to it. And if you want to buy the physical print copies, they're going to be the same as books 1 and 2, which are currently £20 each. So that's the price point for it will be £20. We have to say we haven't put the price of the books up since we started in whenever it was 2020 with them. So it's possible the price of the books will move a little bit, but we're also very conscious that nobody's got any money. So if we can, we won't print many of these, and therefore the print costs will be significantly higher. I don't think the print costs will knock on the door of £20. So, I'm pretty confident we can keep them at that level. Okay, so thanks, Simon. It's not much of an answer. Helen, you've popped your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to say, how lovely to see Ammianus on your list of authors. That's not someone it's delightful to see him on a list because that's it. Ammianus was who I did my doctoral thesis on, so a very soft spot for him. But it's lovely to see such a variety of different sources.
Thanks, Helen. I mean, Hannah, you were quite instrumental in sort of choosing particular texts. You seem to have a lot of good ideas. Do you want to say a little bit about that and how we settled on particular authors?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I mean, it does look, when you do the numbers, there are a lot of Ovid and Virgil, but we really did do a lot of research to try and find authors that were relevant and would be interesting, and maybe authors that, students might not encounter before, or maybe not again. Ammianus, a good example there, but he actually comes up twice in the book. We've got the tsunami and also a bit about migration of people. So, I mean, I think we could... I mean, it's always hard to get more women writers. That was something we really tried to do. We've got a few. I think, yeah, the graffiti pulls in a few more female authors. But yeah, we did our best, I think, to do a wide range while still hitting the big ones as well. So hopefully something for everyone to enjoy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Hannah. Do we have any other questions? No, it's 8:05. Traitors are starting in 55 minutes. So, thanks for coming along tonight. And, you know, if you've got further questions, you know, we're always around. Feel free to ask. As I said earlier, our timelines are to have this ready, physical copies ready, sort of late May, early June. So we're thinking we'll have the print at our end finished at the end of next month. That'll then go away to print. So about a sort of an 8-week period for that, and it should come into the warehouse sort of May, June time. And as I say, if you've got the digital, you should find, and we'll send out a note to, you know, everybody in the UK with a teacher access when it happens, but you should see that it just appears on your, you know, on your landing page sort of sometime in sort of March, maybe April. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all too. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Good evening.
Night.